Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Our mission here is to take complex, globally consequential source material and really transform it into knowledge you can use to give you a genuine shortcut to being well-informed.
Today, we are undertaking a deep dive into what is probably the most discussed and most consequential economic rivalry of our time, the future trajectory of the United States versus China.
Exactly. And this isn't just some abstract political talking point. For you, the listener, it's immediate. It affects the price of your phone, it affects job opportunities, even the cost of your morning coffee. So we've compiled a stack of analysis and data, and our mission today is to cut through all that noise. We want to answer one core question. Will China overtake the U.S. economy sooner than expected?
And that's a huge question. I mean, it sparks debates everywhere, from coffee shops to boardrooms, really because the answer, as the source material makes so clear, depends entirely on how you measure economic power in the first place.
Okay, so let's jump straight into that. The economic report card. We have to start with the big one, the metric everyone uses, GDP, gross domestic product. We all hear the term, but let's just, nail down a clear definition before we get into the arguments.
Right. So GDP is basically the total value of all the final goods and services produced inside a country's borders over a specific time, usually a year. It's the ultimate summary of all the economic activity, the output.
And the thing that's so powerful about it, which the sources really highlight, is just how comprehensive it is. We're literally counting every single thing that creates value.
Every pizza delivered, every haircut.
Every car that comes off the assembly line, every doctor's visit, it all gets added up.
Exactly. And when that total number grows, it's good news. It usually means more jobs, more opportunities.
Yeah.
When it shrinks, that's when you start hearing people worry about a recession. It's a big foundational number.
Okay, so here's the plot twist. The key bit of nuance that explains all the conflicting headlines. If GDP is so universal, why on earth do economists seem to disagree about who's actually winning right now?
Because there are two very different but equally valid ways to measure GDP. And they give you completely different answers about who's on top.
All right, let's break down the first one.
The first is nominal GDP. The easiest way to think about this is like the international price tag method. You take everything a country produces in its own currency, say the Chinese yuan, and you convert it to US dollars using whatever the current exchange rate is.
So it's a direct comparison of financial power on the global stage today. If you're looking at international trade, this is the number that matters because it reflects what currencies are actually worth to each other right now.
Precisely. It's the measure of immediate market weight, of global financial dominance. And if you use that yardstick, the raw current exchange rate, the result is it's undeniable. The United States is still the #1 economy in the world.
Okay, so that's method one. What is the second measure, the one that tells a very different story?
That would be purchasing power parity, or PPP. Now, this method tries to ignore those day-to-day volatile exchange rates. It asks a much more fundamental question about standard of living.
Which is?
It asks, how much can people actually buy with their money inside their own country?
Right, because the cost of things is so different everywhere. The example from the source material was perfect.
Yeah, the $10 example. In New York City, $10 might get you a fancy coffee and maybe a sandwich if you're lucky. But the equivalent of $10 in another country could buy you a full meal, a drink, and dessert. PPP adjusts for that difference.
I've heard economists talk about the Big Mac index for this.
That's a fun way to think about it, yeah. You compare the price of the exact same McDonald's hamburger in different countries to get a rough idea of what money is truly worth locally. It's all about domestic purchasing power.
So when we apply that PPP calculation to China, when we adjust for the fact that a yuan buys a lot more food and services in Beijing than a dollar buys in New York, what's the result?
And this is the plot twist. Using the PPP method, China has already passed the U.S. economy.
Already?
For years now, since the early 2010s, actually. If you measure by the sheer volume of goods and services that citizens can actually consume, the Chinese economy is the largest in the world.
Okay, that is a critical distinction for everyone to grasp. If you're talking global finance, you're probably using nominal GDP. But if you want to know the true size of a country's internal market, its domestic capacity, PTP is arguably the better tool.
It really is. And it explains why two experts can look at the same world and come to opposite conclusions. One's looking at international market value, the other's looking at total domestic consumption. It all comes down to those key terms: output, productivity, and consumption.
With those definitions set, let's pivot to the story of the challenger. I mean, it is without a doubt one of the most remarkable economic transformations in modern history. China's rise.
The scale of the change it's almost hard to comprehend. You really have to go back to 1978 to get the full picture.
The sources paint such a vivid picture of that time. China was mostly isolated, overwhelmingly agricultural. Something like 80% of the population lived in rural areas. Industry was, well, it was primitive.
And millions were living in extreme poverty. It was a centrally planned economy, built on collective farms and just profoundly disconnected from the global system.
And then came the big shift, the reforms under Deng Xiaoping. A strategic decision was made to just open the doors to the world. They started inviting in foreign capital, foreign companies, foreign technology.
It was an offer that the world frankly couldn't refuse. They basically said, look, we have this enormous motivated workforce and we have incredibly low labor costs. Come build your factories here.
And companies from the US, Europe, Japan, they just poured in.
Of course. The main attraction was the sheer scale. We're talking about a workforce of 1.4 billion people. That's more than the US, Canada, and all of Europe combined. That, plus the low costs, is what turned China into the world's factory.
And that opening coincided with another massive internal shift, which was urbanization. The scale of people moving was just unprecedented.
Hundreds of millions of people migrated from farming in rural villages to these new booming cities. And this internal migration created its own economic boom, sort of a self-reinforcing cycle.
The story of Shenzhen is the classic example, isn't it?
It's the perfect example. 40 years ago, it was just a little fishing village. That's it. But because it was made a special economic zone, it became a magnet for investment and labor. Now it's a global tech hub with over 12 million people.
And you can't build a city for 12 million people in a few decades without a monumental amount of construction.
Exactly. Every new person needed housing, roads, power, water. So you had this massive government-led infrastructure boom that created even more jobs and more demand for services. It was like a powerful economic snowball rolling downhill.
Then we get to the evolution of what they were actually making. At first, it was very simple stuff, right? Basic assembly.
Oh, absolutely. Clothing, toys, cheap electronics. For a long time, China was seen as the imitator, the assembler, not the innovator.
But that was just a stage.
It's just a stage. By taking in all that foreign tech, by reverse engineering products, they slowly but surely started moving up the value chain. And today, they're not making simple toys. They're dominant in really sophisticated goods. Computers, electric vehicles, solar panels, and high-speed trains that are, frankly, the envy of the world.
They really did move from just imitation to genuine innovation.
Yeah.
I mean, you look at Chinese companies now, and they are leading in certain areas.
They absolutely are. In things like mobile payments with WeChat Pay and Alipay, they basically leapfrog the West. They're also at the forefront of AI research, e-commerce, and drone technology. They're setting the standards now, not just following them.
So all of this success leads to the core engine of their growth, what the sources call the export strategy and infrastructure cycle. Can you break that down?
Sure. So China used its role as the world's factory to earn massive amounts of foreign currency, dollars, euros, from all the products it was selling globally.
And they didn't just sit on that money.
Not at all. It was aggressively reinvested back into the country. That's what paid for all that world-class infrastructure we mentioned, the modern ports, the highways, the power grids, the research centers.
Which created a kind of positive feedback loop.
A virtuous cycle, exactly. Better infrastructure made it cheaper and faster to produce and ship goods. Cheaper goods meant more exports. More exports meant more money, which funded even better infrastructure. This cycle is what allowed China to maintain those incredible double-digit growth rates, over 10% a year, for so long.
An almost impossible feat for an economy that large. And in the process, they lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty and created this huge new middle class, a complete transformation in just a couple of generations. It's so important that we keep a balanced view here, though. To really understand the challenge ahead for China, we have to turn to the other giant in this race and look at the deep foundational strengths of the U.S. economy. I mean, it's been the world's largest for over a century, for a reason.
That's right. We need to analyze the U.S. economic bedrock. And I think the place you have to start is with its culture of innovation and entrepreneurship. It's arguably its most powerful and hardest to copy advantage.
And this isn't just about having smart people. It's about a whole system, a legal and cultural framework that actually encourages risk-taking. It rewards trying something new, even if you fail.
And that's the environment that gives you world-changing companies, right? Apple, Google, Amazon, Microsoft, Tesla. These are firms that don't just compete in an industry, they create entirely new ones.
But that innovation needs fuel. It needs a constant supply of talent.
which is where the world-class U.S. universities come in. Places like Harvard, MIT, Stanford, they act as magnets, pulling in the best and brightest minds from all over the world. They're effectively the R&D engine, not just for the U.S., but for the entire global economy.
Okay, but let's talk about the big structural advantage, the one that is incredibly difficult for any challenger to overcome, the power of the U.S. dollar.
This is such a critical point. The dollar is the world's primary reserve currency.
What does that actually mean in practical terms?
It means that most international trade, especially for crucial commodities like oil, is done in dollars. It means international banks hold the reserves in dollars. This gives the U.S. what some economists have called an exorbitant privilege.
Because everyone just needs dollars no matter what.
Everyone needs dollars. The constant global demand for them means the U.S. can run huge trade deficits and borrow money much, much more cheaply than any other country could ever hope to. It provides this incredible financial stability and power.
Now let's look inside the U.S. The engine itself. The consumer. The sheer power of American consumer spending.
It's massive. The U.S. domestic market is the biggest and most reliable driver of global consumption. American consumers support millions of businesses, not just in the U.S., but around the world. For any global company, getting access to the U.S. market is seen as, essential.
And there's a key difference in the structure of the economy. If China is the world's factory, the U.S. is something else.
It's a services-dominated economy. About 80% of all economic activity in the U.S. comes from services. We're talking about things like healthcare, finance, tech, consulting, education.
And these are high-value sectors.
Extremely high value. Unlike a physical product, you don't have to ship a piece of software or a financial product on a boat. The services exported from Wall Street, Silicon Valley, even Hollywood, they generate immense value and are much harder for another country to just copy and replicate.
And finally, there's the structural flexibility of the economy, the ease of starting a business.
Right. The strong protection of property rights, access to deep pools of venture capital. This all creates an environment where the economy can adapt really quickly. If one industry declines, capital and talent can pivot to a new emerging sector. It keeps the system dynamic.
The sources also point to diversity as a key economic strength.
Yeah, and not just in a cultural sense. A diverse population brings a wider range of skills, perspectives, and global networks. That variety is a constant fuel for the kind of creativity you need to stay on the cutting edge of innovation.
Okay, so now we shift back to China. Let's look at the specific forces that are actively pushing it forward, the reasons why that fast-track overtake scenario is still on the table for so many analysts.
The first catalyst is just aggressive state-backed technology investment. This isn't just a few companies trying things out. This is a national mandate. You have strategic plans like Made in China 2025, which explicitly targets global leadership in key high-tech fields.
So they're just flooding these future industries with capital. The electric vehicle sector seems like the perfect example of this.
It's a textbook case. Chinese companies like BYD are becoming global leaders, not just in the number of cars they sell, but in pioneering the battery technology that powers them. They're moving ahead of many of the legacy automakers in the West.
The second major force is the modern infrastructure advantage. We touched on this, but it's a huge deal.
It's a massive advantage. While you hear a lot of criticism about aging infrastructure in the U.S., China has spent the last few decades building what is probably the most modern physical network in the world.
And that has a direct economic impact, right? It's not just about nice-looking train stations.
Not at all. Think about it. High-speed rail connects all your major cities and manufacturing hubs. Modern automated ports can process shipments with incredible speed. This superior infrastructure just makes business more efficient. It lowers the cost of everything.
Then there's the third driver, which is a big structural shift away from exports, the rise of the Chinese middle class.
This is a huge one. For years, China's growth depended on selling things to the U.S. and Europe. But now they have hundreds of millions of their own citizens with real spending power. They've created their own enormous domestic market.
Which acts as a kind of economic shock absorber.
A massive one. This internal market, which is hungry for cars and travel and entertainment, can sustain growth even if global demand slows down or trade tensions get worse. It makes their economy much more resilient than it used to be.
And finally, there's the big international play. the Belt and Road Initiative, or BRI.
Right. This is China's huge global strategy. We're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars invested in building infrastructure ports, railways, power grids, all across Asia, Africa, and parts of Europe.
And the strategy here is multi-layered. It's not just about building a railroad.
It's incredibly strategic. On one level, it helps China secure access to natural resources it needs. On another, it opens up new trade routes. And maybe most importantly, it creates huge new markets for Chinese construction companies, for their technology and for their products. It's a long-term plan to embed Chinese economic influence around the world.
Although the sources are also clear that the BRI comes with significant controversy, the whole debt trap narrative.
Yes, and that's a critical counterpoint. Many of these projects are funded by loans from Chinese banks. And when a partner country can't pay back the loan, which has happened, China can end up taking control of the asset like a strategic port. So it's seen by critics not just as development, but as a geopolitical tool with real risks for the countries involved.
All right, now for the other side of the coin. We need to look at the serious headwinds and challenges facing China, the things that could slow down or even stop that rise to the top.
And the first one is the most obvious, the economic slowdown. Those incredible double-digit growth rates we talked about, those are history. Today, even hitting 5% growth is a real struggle for them.
And some of that is just natural, right? It's the law of large numbers.
It is. The bigger your economy gets, the harder it is to maintain a high percentage growth rate. It's like a sprinter. You can't maintain your top speed forever. Eventually, you have to settle into a more sustainable pace.
But there are more severe structural problems, and the biggest one seems to be demographics, the aging population.
This is probably their single greatest long-term challenge. Because of the lingering effects of the one-child policy, China is getting old before it got rich. They're facing a shrinking workforce and a rapidly growing number of retirees.
Let's just define demographics for our listener. It's just the statistical makeup of a population, right?
Exactly. And an aging population means the ratio of retired people who draw on social services to working people who pay for them is getting really unbalanced. The economic consequences of that are, well, they're severe.
Fewer young workers means less overall production.
Less production capacity, right. And at the same time, you have this huge new burden on your healthcare and pension systems, which means money gets diverted away from productive investments like research and development. It's a huge drag on the economy.
And it's a problem the U.S. mostly avoids through immigration, which China doesn't really have in the same way.
That's a key difference. Next up is the challenge of productivity. China's kind of reached the limit of the easy growth, which came from just building more factories and putting more people to work.
So to keep growing now, they have to get more productive. They have to get more output from the same amount of labor and capital.
Exactly. And that's the hard part. That requires genuine innovation, better management, real technological breakthroughs. It requires a shift from simple manufacturing to a high-value, creative economy. And that transition is proving to be very, very difficult.
We also have to talk about the massive debt issue.
The elephant in the room. All of that rapid growth in construction was financed with enormous borrowing, especially by local governments and state-owned companies.
The sources mention these things called LGFVs, local government financing vehicles.
Yes, that was a way for local provinces to borrow huge sums of money off the books to fund all these infrastructure projects. The problem is a lot of that investment was inefficient. It led to things like the famous ghost cities. Entire cities built with nobody living in them.
So now they're left with a mountain of debt.
A mountain of debt that really constrains their ability to stimulate the economy today. They have to spend their energy managing this existing debt instead of investing in the future. It's a major financial risk.
And on top of all these internal problems, there are growing external pressures.
A lot of them. You have international companies diversifying their supply chains, the whole China plus one strategy. They're moving some production to places like Vietnam, India, or Mexico to reduce their reliance on China.
And then there are the ongoing trade tensions.
Right. The constant disputes over tariffs, technology, and market access create a lot of uncertainty. And uncertainty is terrible for long-term business investment. It just makes it harder for China to attract the foreign capital that fueled its initial rise.
Now, to be fair, we have to turn that critical lens back on the United States. It's not like the U.S. is without its own serious challenges. We can't just assume its dominance will last forever.
Absolutely not. The first point is just rising competition. The U.S. has to accept that economic leadership isn't a given anymore. Other countries, especially China, are investing strategically in their own futures. To stay ahead, the U.S. has to constantly work at it.
And there are long-term internal issues, like the decline of manufacturing.
For decades, factories moved overseas. That's hollowed out a lot of local economies, and it's reduced the country's ability to produce essential goods itself.
Which created the vulnerability of supply chain reliance.
We saw that very clearly during the pandemic, didn't we? When basic products were suddenly hard to find because the supply chains were all routed through Asia. Reducing that reliance is now a huge policy goal. But it's not easy or cheap to do.
And we have to talk about the U.S. government debt. We mentioned the exorbitant privilege of the dollar, but that doesn't make the debt go away.
The problem isn't just the size of the debt, it's the opportunity cost. The money spent on interest payments is money that can't be spent on other things, like education, scientific research, or fixing aging infrastructure. It limits your ability to invest in your own future.
And while the U.S. has these world-class universities at the top, there are real concerns about the broader education system and workforce pipeline.
Yeah, inequality in the public school system is a major issue. It means you're not always producing the skilled workforce you need to power those high-tech service industries that are the core of the economy.
Finally, the sources point to political obstacles.
Impartially, of course. But they note that deep internal divisions can make it very hard to pass the kind of stable, long-term economic policies you need to stay competitive. Things like big infrastructure projects or consistent funding for research can get bogged down in short-term political fights.
So the big takeaway here for our listener is that the U.S. isn't necessarily getting weaker, but the rest of the world is getting stronger. The economic pie is being divided more evenly.
That's the perfect way to put it. It's a natural result of global development. It just means the competition is going to be a lot tougher from now on.
Okay, we've laid out all the strengths, all the weaknesses. It's time for the crystal ball. When will China overtake the U.S.? What do the future scenarios look like?
The honest professional answer is that nobody knows for sure. I mean, the fact that predictions range from 2030 to 2040 to 1 never tells you just how much uncertainty there is.
And these predictions are so tricky because they're based on assumptions, right? Assumptions about future growth rates, policy choices, population trends, things that can all change.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But we can organize the possibilities into 3 main scenarios that come from the source material.
Let's hear them. Scenario 1.
Scenario 1 is the fast track. This is the optimistic case for China. They successfully make that difficult transition to an innovation-led economy. Their productivity soars, they manage their debt, and their huge domestic market keeps growing strong. If all that happens, they could pass the U.S. in nominal GDP, within the next decade or 2.
Okay, what's scenario 2?
Scenario 2 is the slowdown. This is where all those headwinds we talked about really bite. The aging population becomes a huge drag. The debt crisis leads to a long period of stagnation like Japan experienced. In this case, China's growth slows to just 2 or 3% a year. The gap with the U.S. stops closing, and they might never actually catch up in nominal terms.
And the third possibility?
Scenario 3 is stable competition. In this future, neither side really wins. Both economies keep growing, but they remain pretty close in size. They end up sharing global influence, but in different areas. The U.S. might lead in finance and software, while China leads in manufacturing and green tech. Power is more spread out, and the rivalry just becomes a permanent feature of the global landscape.
And we always have to remember why predictions like these so often fail. The black swan events.
The things you just can't model. A global pandemic, a major war, a financial crisis, or some wild technological breakthrough that comes out of nowhere and changes everything.
And it's so important to remember that GDP isn't everything. Even if China's nominal GDP does pass the US's one day, the US would still have these huge non-GDP advantages. The dollar, its cultural influence, its military, its innovation ecosystem.
That's right. Economic size is just one piece of a much bigger puzzle of global power.
Which brings us to our last big section. Why does any of this matter to you, the listener? What are the real-world global implications?
Well, the biggest one is the impact on global trade. Together, these two countries account for something like 40% of the world's entire economy. They're the 2 biggest nodes in the global supply chain. Their economic health basically sets the price and availability of almost everything you buy.
The smartphone example is perfect. The design is done in the US, the components are made all over the world, but the assembly is done in China. The 2 are just completely intertwined. Any friction between them immediately sends ripples everywhere.
But there's a positive side of this rivalry, too. It accelerates innovation.
How so?
Well, the race to be the leader in AI, in biotech, in renewable energy, It forces both countries to pour huge amounts of money and talent into research and development.
Yeah.
They're constantly trying to one-up each other.
And the rest of the world benefits from that. When one of them has a breakthrough, the other has to match it, and eventually that new, better technology becomes available and cheaper for everyone.
Exactly. Competition drives progress. And for all the talk of conflict, we can't forget about cooperation. Despite the rivalry, they still have to work together on huge global issues where they have a mutual interest.
Like climate change or managing the global financial system.
Right. There's this constant balance between competition and collaboration that keeps the whole system from falling apart.
Yeah.
They have to cooperate to some degree because the alternative would be disastrous for both of them and for the entire world.
Okay, to wrap this up, let's give you a practical tool. How to talk about this stuff. How can you, our listener, analyze the communication and speak about these economic issues confidently?
Well, looking at how the experts in our sources talk, the first rule is simplicity is key.
Yeah.
They avoid overly complex jargon. The goal is to be clear, not to sound like a textbook. So instead of exorbitant privilege, you could just say the dollar gives the U.S. a lot of financial power.
And it helps to have a simple framework. I like the one from the sources. What is happening? Why does it matter? And how might things change? If you can answer those 3 questions about any part of this topic, you'll sound incredibly well-informed.
And when you're sharing your own analysis, it's always good to use softening language. Phrases like, I think, or it seems to me, or some analysts believe, it makes you sound more thoughtful and less like you're stating an absolute fact.
And use good connecting words to build your arguments. Words like while, however, in contrast, for example. While the U.S. leads in financial services, China, in contrast, is dominant in manufacturing. It just makes your comparisons sharper.
And finally, please, use the language of uncertainty when you talk about the future. That's what professionals do. Words like could, might, potentially, if. Saying China will overtake the U.S. in 2035 sounds amateurish. Saying China could potentially overtake the U.S. in the 2030s if certain trends continue, that sounds like a professional analysis.
So we have covered a lot of ground today. We've gone from the definitions of GDP all the way to China's transformation, U.S. strengths, the challenges both face, and the future scenarios.
And the key takeaway for you is that this isn't some simple race with a finish line. It's a complex, evolving relationship that's going to be defined by both competition and cooperation for decades to come. And understanding that dynamic is it's essential to being an informed citizen of the world today.
And we ended on the idea that this competition drives innovation that benefits everyone. So here's a final thought for you to take away from this deep dive. We focus entirely on the U.S. and China. But with economic power and technology spreading all over the world, what if the next great breakthrough, something in energy or biotech that completely changes the game, what if it doesn't come from either of them? What if it comes from India or Brazil or a lab in Europe? How would that kind of outside disruption alter all 3 of the scenarios we just talked about? Something to think about until we next take the deep dive.
Okay, let's unpack this. Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we are digging into one of the biggest questions of our time, the future of the world's 2 economic superpowers, China and the U.S.
And we're going beyond the headlines here. This isn't just about who's bigger right now. We're looking at the road ahead, what's driving them, and what could, seriously trip them up.
Right. We've pulled together a ton of sources, expert analysis, economic forecasts, research papers, all focused on what comes next. And our mission really is to help you cut through the political noise on both sides.
We want to get at the real mechanics, the strategic bets China is making, the deep structural issues both countries are facing, and what all of this actually means for you.
We'll start with a quick look at how we even measure economic power, because that choice itself is, it's often a political one.
Then we'll pivot to the core question. Can a centrally planned, top-down economy actually out-innovate a decentralized, democratic one in the long run? The data we've got really helps frame that debate.
Our goal is to make sure that by the end of this, you're a much smarter news consumer. You won't just hear a headline about GDP. You'll understand the demographic time bombs and the supply chain chess moves happening underneath.
This is the competition that's defining the 21st century. So, yeah, let's get into it.
All right, let's start with the measurements. Because how you measure really determines the story you tell. We've got gross domestic product, nominal GDP.
Right, that's the simple one. It's the total value of everything a country produces, measured with current exchange rates. It's the number you hear thrown around most often.
And it's the number that politicians and, media outlets love to cherry pick.
Oh, absolutely. It's all about perspective. If you're in Washington and you want to project strength, you're going to use nominal GDP every single time. Why? Because the U.S. economy is still trillions of dollars larger by that measure.
It sends a clear message of continued dominance on the world stage. It's a geopolitical tool, really.
Exactly. But if you're an analyst in Beijing or you want to highlight the shift in economic gravity, you're going to talk about purchasing power parity, PPP.
Because PPP tells a very different story.
A much, much different story. It adjusts for the cost of living. It asks a more fundamental question: what can your money actually buy inside your own country?
Okay, let's make this concrete. I think the example we found is perfect for this. Let's use Mike in New York and Lai in Shanghai.
Perfect. So Mike, he's a manager in NYC, earns, say, $5,000 a month. Lai is in a similar role in Shanghai, and his salary, when you just convert it using the exchange rate, is about $2,000.
So on paper, nominally, Mike is more than twice as rich. It's not even close.
Not even close. But then reality hits. The cost of living. Mike's rent for a decent but small apartment in New York, it could easily be $2,500.
And that's probably being optimistic. Then lunch is $15 for something simple. A monthly subway pass is what, $130?
Right. So after just those three basic things, rent, a simple lunch, and transport, Mike has about, what, $2,360 left over.
Okay, now let's look at Lai in Shanghai.
His situation is completely different. A similar apartment might only cost him $400 a month.
How is it that cheap?
It could be state-subsidized housing, different models for land value. The whole system is just structured differently. So his lunch might be $3, his monthly transit, maybe $20.
So Ever's basic costs, Lai is left with almost $1,600.
Exactly. He's left with about $1,577. So that initial gap of $3,000 between them, it shrinks to just a few $100 when you look at their actual purchasing power.
So the ability they have to, save money or buy a new phone or go on vacation, it's suddenly very, very similar.
That's the power of PPP. It gives you a much truer sense of the scale of a domestic economy. It shows you the real size of the internal market and the consumer base, which is, absolutely critical for understanding where China is heading.
So the key takeaway for you listening is this. The next time you see a headline about the size of China's economy versus the U.S., just pause and ask, which measurement are they using?
And why did they choose it? Because that choice tells you everything about the narrative they're trying to push. Understanding that difference lets you see past a lot of the political spin.
Okay, so we've established just how massive that internal Chinese economy is. Now let's pivot to the future. Let's talk about the strategic engines that China is building to, move beyond just being the world's factory.
This is where it gets really interesting and where we see that power of centralized planning in action. China isn't just hoping for innovation to happen. They are picking winners. They're pouring state money into specific high-tech sectors they believe will dominate the future.
And let's start with the bottom one, artificial intelligence, AI. This has been declared a national priority.
And that's an understatement. We're talking about a level of commitment that's almost hard to comprehend. Billions, maybe even trillions of dollars in the long run are being directed into AI research, development, and most importantly, implementation.
So it's a whole of government push.
Entirely. They see mastering AI as essential for everything: economic leadership, national security, military power. It's the cornerstone of their future strategy.
But it's not just about the money, right? They have another advantage, a really unique one.
Data. The data on 1.4 billion people. In the world of AI, data is the fuel. The more data you feed a machine learning model, the smarter and more powerful it becomes.
And in China, there are, let's say, fewer constraints on collecting and using that data compared to Western countries with strict privacy laws.
That's a huge structural advantage. It allows their tech companies to train AI models on a scale and with a level of detail that's very difficult for competitors in the US or Europe to match.
Okay, but I have to play devil's advocate here. We've seen top-down government plans fail before. They build these massive, wasteful ghost projects. What's the evidence this time is different? That this will actually lead to real game-changing breakthroughs?
That's a very fair point, and it's a critical question. The evidence so far suggests that their strength is less in the initial disruptive invention and more in the speed and scale of application.
What do you mean?
We see it in the real world. Think of the sophisticated facial recognition systems that are now just part of the urban fabric in major cities. AI-powered medical diagnostics being rolled out in hospitals, hyper-efficient traffic management systems.
So the U.S. might invent the core algorithm.
Right, but China can deploy it to 1 billion people almost overnight, and that deployment generates a massive feedback loop of new data, which makes the AI even smarter, even faster. The sheer scale of implementation becomes its own competitive advantage.
I see. So that feedback loop is the key.
It's a huge part of it. Okay, moving from the digital to the physical. The next huge area is electric vehicles, EVs.
And this is a sector where they've gone from follower to leader in an incredibly short amount of time.
The numbers are just staggering. China now produces more EVs than any other country on Earth. And you see their big companies like BYD are now serious global players. In some markets, they're even outselling Tesla.
And this wasn't an accident. This was a result of a decade of very deliberate government policy. Huge subsidies, clear targets. It's a textbook case of their industrial planning working.
And it's not just about cars. This is a key point from the sources. It's a whole transportation revolution. They've electrified buses, trucks, and millions upon millions of scooters. They achieved a level of electrification years ago that other countries are still just, writing policy papers about.
Which brings us to the infrastructure advantage.
Yes. While the US and Europe are still debating how to fund a national charging network, China just went ahead and built one. It's extensive. It's everywhere.
And that gets rid of this single biggest hurdle for most people thinking about buying an EV. Range anxiety.
Exactly. The fear of running out of power. In China, that's much less of a concern. So what does this all mean? It means they're positioning themselves to lead a massive global industry for the next 50 years. The era of the internal combustion engine dominated by the US, Germany, Japan is ending. The new era is batteries and software, and China is aiming to be the new Detroit.
Okay, and that connects directly to the next point, which might be their single biggest strategic advantage. Control over the renewable energy supply chain.
This is the long game. It's an incredibly shrewd strategic move. They realize that the most important commodity of the 21st century might not be oil, but the hardware you need to replace oil.
Solar panels, wind turbines, and the batteries that power everything.
Precisely. And the key statistic from our sources is just mind-blowing. China manufactures roughly 80% of the world's solar panels.
Let's just sit with that for a second. Not half, 80%.
Think about the geopolitical power that it gives them. The entire world is trying to fight climate change. Europe has its Green Deal. The US is trying to transition its energy grid. And who do they all have to buy from?
China. They've essentially cornered the market on the key hardware for the global energy transition.
And it's not just about assembling the final panels. That's the surface level analysis. They control the whole supply chain, from mining and processing the raw materials like polysilicon, to manufacturing the cells, to the final assembly.
Full vertical integration. It gives them incredible efficiency and, of course, leverage.
An incredible risk for the rest of the world. If Beijing ever decided to, say, restrict exports of solar panels or the materials needed to make them, it could halt green energy projects across the globe overnight. It's a powerful economic weapon.
Okay, so we've talked about their external strategy. Let's look inward now. For a long time, the big criticism of China was its over-reliance on exports. But that's been changing, right?
It's been changing deliberately. They're trying to shift their growth model to rely more on their own domestic consumers. And the scale of that consumer base is now just off the charts.
We're talking about a middle class of over 400 million people.
Which, to put that in context, is larger than the entire population of the United States. And this isn't a group just buying basics anymore. They have real discretionary income.
And what are they buying?
Everything. High-end smartphones, cars, international travel, private education, entertainment. This consumer power is fundamentally reshaping global markets.
And the key strategic benefit of this is what? Independence.
Exactly. It makes their economy far less vulnerable to what happens in the rest of the world. If there's a recession in the US or Europe and demand for exports falls, they have this massive internal engine that can, in theory, keep driving growth. It's a shock absorber.
The car sales numbers really highlight this. I think in 2023, it was something like 26 million cars sold in China.
Compared to about 16 million in the US. In many high-value categories, China is already the world's largest consumer market, and this shift is a sign of a maturing economy.
Finally, let's touch on the Belt and Road Initiative, or BRI. This is China projecting its economic power outward in a very physical way.
It's arguably the most ambitious global infrastructure project in history. I mean, maybe since the Marshall Plan.
So in simple terms, what is it?
It's China funding and building roads, ports, railways, power plants, and communication networks all across the world, especially across Asia, Africa, and parts of Europe.
So what's the logic behind it?
It's strategic. If you're producing a massive amount of goods, you need efficient ways to get those goods to market. And you want to build political influence along the way, so you build the physical connections.
We're talking about things like high-speed rail in Laos, a major port in Pakistan, power plants across Africa.
And the Digital Silk Road, which is about expanding their telecommunications infrastructure and standards globally. It's all about creating long-term trade routes and economic relationships that are, centered on China.
No, we have to be nuanced here. The sources show a real split in opinion on the BRI.
Oh, completely. For many developing countries, it's a huge benefit. They're getting much-needed infrastructure built quickly, often without the political strings that can come with Western aid.
But there's a serious counterargument, the debt trap diplomacy concern.
Right. The worry is that China lends huge sums of money for these massive projects, and if a country can't pay it back, they're forced to hand over control of strategic assets like a port for 99 years. It's a very complex mix of development aid, strategic investment, and financial risk.
Okay, so it's easy to get caught up in the story of unstoppable growth, the new high-speed trains, the EV factories. But for a real deep dive, we have to be balanced. Let's talk about the major headwinds, the internal challenges that could slow China down.
Absolutely. And this is where that central paradox of their system comes into play. Centralized planning is great for building big things fast, but it can be very slow to adapt to deep structural problems. And the first one is the biggest of all, demographics.
The ticking time bomb of the one-child policy.
A policy that worked, in a sense. It curbed population growth. But now, decades later, the bill is coming due, and it's creating a massive, maybe even irreversible economic problem.
The simple fact is the population is now shrinking.
Shrinking and aging very, very rapidly. You have far fewer young people entering the workforce to replace a huge wave of people who are now retiring.
Which puts an incredible strain on the entire system. You've got fewer workers trying to support a growing number of retirees.
And the economic consequences are profound. Fewer workers means your potential for economic growth is immediately capped. You simply can't produce as much. At the same time, you have skyrocketing costs for healthcare and pensions.
It's a headwind that even the best AI technology can't completely solve.
Right. And while the government has, of course, scrapped the one-child policy, it takes generations to turn a demographic trend around. This is a problem that will be weighing on their growth for decades.
And unlike the U.S., which can use immigration to bring in skilled workers and sort of plug those gaps, China's options are much more limited. This is probably their single biggest long-term challenge.
It leads directly into the second major roadblock, which is a classic one in economics, the middle income trap.
Okay, let's break that down. The first stage of growth is the easy part, right?
You've got cheap labor, you open factories, you make simple things, and you export them to the world. China was the master of this for 30 years.
But then success creates a new problem. The country gets richer, and workers demand higher wages.
Exactly. And suddenly, you're not the cheapest place to make things anymore. Companies start looking to Vietnam, or Bangladesh, or Mexico.
And that's the trap. You're now too expensive to compete on cheap stuff, but you're not yet advanced enough to compete with, say, Germany or the US on high-tech, high-value products.
To escape, you have to make a huge leap up the value chain. You have to shift from an economy based on cheap labor to one based on innovation, high-level productivity, and creating your own technology.
So instead of assembling iPhones, you have to be the one designing them.
That's the perfect analogy. And this transition is incredibly difficult. Many countries get stuck. China's massive bet on AI and EVs is basically their attempt to force this jump. It's a high-stakes gamble.
Okay, and what fueled all that rapid growth in infrastructure building?
Debt.
A mountain of it. And now that debt is becoming a source of major instability.
It's not so much the central government's debt, but where it's concentrated, right?
Exactly. The big problem areas are local governments, state-owned companies, and especially the real estate sector.
Which we've all seen in the headlines with companies like Evergrande. They borrowed incredible amounts of money, assuming the property boom would never end.
And when it cooled off, they couldn't make their payments, leading to defaults that sent shockwaves through the system.
But you're saying the bigger hidden risk is with local governments? I think so. They use these things called local government financing vehicles, or LGFVs. They're basically off-the-books companies set up to borrow money for big projects, getting around central borrowing limits.
That kind of shadow banking system.
Essentially, yes. And these LGFVs have accumulated trillions in hidden debt. If too many of them start to fail, it creates a huge risk for the entire financial system. Too much debt just suffocates an economy. Money that could be used for investment goes to paying interest instead.
And finally, there are external pressures building up.
Right. The rest of the world isn't just standing still. First, if the global economy slows down, as it has been, demand for Chinese exports falls. That's a direct hit.
And then there are the geopolitical pressures, the trade restrictions.
Specifically on technology, the U.S. has been very targeted in restricting China's access to the most advanced semiconductor chips and the equipment needed to make them.
The goal being to slow down their progress in AI and military tech.
It forces Chinese companies to spend billions trying to reinvent that technology from scratch, which is expensive and slow. And this leads to the last point. Companies are diversifying their supply chains.
The China plus one strategy.
Exactly. Businesses don't want to have all their eggs in one basket anymore, so they're moving some production to Vietnam, India, Mexico. It's not a flood out of China, but it's a steady trend that chips away at their manufacturing base.
So a lot of very serious internal and external challenges to manage.
For sure. It's a much more complicated picture than just straight line growth.
Okay, so to keep this balance, we have to turn the lens around. The United States has its own set of deep structural challenges that could hold back its growth. It's not a one-sided story.
Not at all. And let's start with something you can physically see, the aging infrastructure.
Yeah, if you travel a lot internationally, the contrast can be pretty stark. You land at a brand new airport in Asia and then fly into some major hubs in the US.
And it feels like you've gone back in time a few decades. The American Society of Civil Engineers gives the U.S. a C- on its infrastructure report card. We're talking bridges, roads, the power grid, a lack of high-speed rail.
Now, there have been big infrastructure bills passed recently.
True, but the key phrase here is investment backlog. We're talking about decades of putting off maintenance and upgrades. So now it's not about building new things from scratch, like in China. It's the much more expensive and complicated job of fixing and replacing a massive old system.
And the political system makes it hard. In China, they can just decide to build a high-speed rail network and do it. In the U.S., a single project can get tied up in debates and budget fights for years, even decades.
That inconsistency costs the economy billions in lost productivity every year.
Next up, let's talk about manufacturing. The U.S. was the world's factory for a long time.
It was the undisputed giant. But over the last 40 years, a lot of that work moved overseas in search of cheaper labor. And that created real economic pain in huge parts of the country, the Rust Belt.
Right. Now, it's important to be clear. The U.S. still manufactures a lot of high-value stuff.
Oh, absolutely. U.S. manufacturing today is very high-tech, very automated. Think aerospace, advanced electronics. The output in dollar terms is still huge, but it requires far fewer workers.
So the challenge is that entire communities were built around the old factory model, and many have never recovered from that transition.
It's a tough economic and social problem, and it's why you now see policies trying to onshore critical manufacturing, like for semiconductors, using big government subsidies. It's a recognition that some production is strategically important to have at home.
Okay, so infrastructure, manufacturing.
Yeah.
What about human capital, education?
This is a story of extremes in the U.S. At the very top, you have the best research universities in the world, Harvard, MIT, Stanford. They are incredible engines of innovation that attract the best minds from around the globe.
But the weakness is at the foundation, the K-12 public education system.
There are persistent worries there. Stagnant math and science scores, huge inequalities between wealthy and poor districts. Meanwhile, competitors like China and South Korea have been laser-focused on improving their foundational education, especially in STEM.
Science, technology, engineering, and math.
Exactly. The modern economy needs more and more people with those skills. If your own schools aren't producing enough of them, you become dependent on immigration to fill those high-tech jobs. Or worse, you face a skills gap that slows down innovation.
Which brings us back to the fundamental political contrast, long-term planning.
This might be the biggest structural difference. Big economic projects, whether it's fixing infrastructure or reforming education, they take decades of consistent effort.
And China's system is built for that. They can make a 20-year plan and stick to it.
While the U.S. system, with its 2- and 4-year election cycles and intense political polarization, struggles to maintain focus on anything long-term. A project started by one administration is often defunded or changed by the next.
That inconsistency is a major brake on progress for big national projects. It's a structural handicap when competing against a system capable of that kind of long-term unified focus.
So we've laid out the strengths and weaknesses on both sides, which brings us to the big question. Who wins and when?
And the first, most honest answer is that the experts are completely divided. Their predictions are all over the place.
Yeah, a few years ago, when China's growth seemed unstoppable, the consensus was that they'd overtake the U.S. in nominal GDP by, say, 2030 or 2035. It felt almost inevitable.
But even then, there were skeptics who said, hang on, you're underestimating the debt, the demographics. They were predicting it might not happen until 2050. Or maybe even never.
And what's really interesting is that in just the last couple of years, the consensus has shifted. More experts are now less confident about a quick Chinese takeover.
Why the change of heart?
It's a direct result of seeing the severity of their property crisis, the financial wobbles, and the new data showing just how fast their population is declining. The short-term problems are proving to be much more severe than many expected.
But we should always be careful with predictions.
We have to be. Economies are not simple, linear systems. They're full of surprises. That's why it's much smarter to think in terms of scenarios, not single predictions.
Okay, so let's walk through the 3 main future scenarios that the experts are debating.
Scenario 1, we'll call it China surges ahead. In this future, they manage to navigate their problems. Their huge bets on AI and other tech pay off, giving them the productivity boost they need to avoid the middle income trap.
And their middle class keeps spending, which stabilizes the economy from within.
Right. If that happens, China becomes the clear #1 economy by 2035 or 2040. Chinese tech standards become the global norm, and their currency, the yuan, starts to seriously challenge the US dollar. A clear shift in power.
Okay, what's scenario 2?
Scenario 2 is the slowdown continues. Here, China's internal problems, the debt, the demographics, prove to be too much. They get stuck. Meanwhile, the U.S. manages to get its act together on things like infrastructure and R&D.
In that world, the U.S. holds on to its economic lead. The dollar stays supreme. China remains a huge economic power, but it's a constrained number 2, not a dominant number 1.
Then there's the third possibility, scenario 3. Parallel powers. This is maybe the most complex and some would say the most likely outcome.
Where neither side wins.
Exactly. Both economies keep growing, but neither achieves total dominance. They end up leading in different areas. The U.S. stays on top in foundational innovation, things like biotech and software. China dominates advanced manufacturing, supply chains, and green energy hardware.
So you have a world with 2 balanced superpowers who have to compete and cooperate at the same time.
A bipolar economic world, and we have to remember why any long-term prediction is so shaky.
History's a good guide here.
A great guide. In the early 1990s, everyone was convinced Japan was going to economically overtake the U.S. It was the consensus view, and it was completely wrong. Japan entered decades of stagnation.
And nobody predicted the 2008 financial crisis or a global pandemic in 2020 that would shut down the entire world.
These black swan events can change everything overnight, which leads to a really important tip for you for how to talk about this stuff with confidence.
Use hedging language.
Yes. Words like might, could, potentially, possibly. They're the language of an intelligent, critical thinker. It's always smarter to say, China could surpass the U.S. if X and Y happen, than to make a bold, certain prediction that will probably be wrong.
Okay, so let's bring all of this home. This isn't just some abstract, high-level debate. This competition has a direct impact on your life, your job, and your wallet.
Absolutely. Let's start with jobs. This constant economic churn creates and destroys opportunities all the time.
So on one hand, a factory in your town might close due to competition from China.
But on the other hand, that massive, growing Chinese middle class creates huge new demand for goods and services from your country. So it might create new jobs in agriculture or high-end design or tourism. It's a trade-off.
And no matter who leads in technology, whether it's U.S. or Chinese companies, they're going to need a global talent pool. So understanding where the strategic investment is going can help you figure out where the high-demand jobs of the future will be.
Now let's talk about the price of things you buy every day.
Your phone, your TV, your clothes. For years, Chinese manufacturing has made countless products way more affordable for everyone.
Competition is good for consumers. It drives down prices, but that stability is fragile.
Right. when trade tensions flare up and governments start imposing tariffs.
Which are just taxes on imported goods.
The prices you pay at the store go up. A tariff on Chinese goods isn't paid by China, it's paid by the importer and ultimately by you.
And if there's a serious disruption to the supply chain, say a conflict or a sudden policy change, you get scarcity. And scarcity means higher prices for everything from cars to computers. The US-China relationship directly impacts your personal inflation rate.
But there's a big silver lining to all this competition.
A huge one. It massively accelerates technological progress for everyone.
It's like a new kind of space race. Both countries are pouring money into R&D, trying to be the leader in AI, clean energy, biotech.
And the breakthroughs that come from that race don't stay within one country's borders. It's what economists call innovation spillover.
A new medical discovery, a more efficient solar panel, a better battery. Those things eventually benefit all of humanity.
The intense competition actually pushes human progress forward faster than it might have happened otherwise.
All right, we have covered a massive amount of ground. So before we wrap up, let's pull it all together with that simple what, why, future framework so you can walk away with the key points locked in.
Okay, so number one, what's happening? The US and China, the world's two largest economies, are in an intense competition across all the key sectors of the future. AI, EVs, green tech, you name it.
China's model is driven by state planning and massive scale. The U.S. model relies on decentralized innovation, but is often slowed down by political division.
Number two, why it matters. This competition is not just happening over there. It directly affects global trade, the prices you pay for everyday goods, and the pace of technological change that will shape our lives.
And number three, the future outlook. The experts don't agree. A simple winner-takes-all outcome is unlikely. What's more probable is a long, complex balancing act, which could result in a world with two parallel superpowers leading in different fields.
And remember that confidence tip we talked about? The smartest thing you can say when discussing the future is, I'm not sure, but here are the factors pointing in different directions. It shows you understand the complexity.
By understanding all these forces, the meaning of PPP, the weight of demographics, the challenges of infrastructure, you're just better equipped to make smart decisions about your own career, your investments, and your future.
And here's one final thought to leave you with. This isn't just a race to see who has the biggest GDP number in 2040. It's a competition between two fundamentally different systems, two different ways of organizing an economy and a society.
Centralized command versus decentralized markets. And the real test, the ultimate battleground, won't be about who can build more roads. It will be about which system proves better at consistently fostering true, groundbreaking innovation over the long haul.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the defining economic story of our time.
We'll catch you on the next one.